Thank you to Prayaas for having me here today. I'm going to be talking about my art exhibit currently on display at Center on Contemporary Art in Seattle. The show is called I'm Trying to Tell You Something. This is an immersive exhibit about intimate partner violence and femicide. This is a street view of the gallery the night of the opening, and I'm going to be showing you images of the night of the opening so that you can orient to the space and get a feel for the gallery. I'm going to discuss some challenges with visualizing loss. The architecture of Memorial has often been an area of controversy, polarized response, and criticism. Some places of Memorial have first been rejected, only to be accepted and revered by the public over time. Minimalism in memorial art has been criticized as substanceless, inappropriate, not glorious enough, not reverent enough in creating powerful monuments, or even running the risk of creating invisibility. Others feel that modern art abstraction can appeal to the collective unconscious, which allows for multiple translations of a memorial over time. This is where I situate my own intention. Tai Nguyen, in Monuments as Commitments, states, monuments are not only backward-looking, but also forward-looking and action-directing. They can express commitments to some value or course or enshrine a commitment to act. Anti-memorial art aims to challenge or oppose traditional forms of memorial in order to disrupt dominant narratives. Anti-memorial art means to give voice to those marginalized and encourage critical dialogue regarding our history. These are some of the frames I've held close in relation to these abstract works. These paintings were first my own embodied performance as a survivor, as a clinician in the mental health field, and as someone who has a loved one currently experiencing intimate partner violence. When I discussed with the gallery this body of work, and we determined their space would be a good fit for art and social action, I began to imagine the space. I wanted to create a highly immersive and educational experience to meet the public on many different levels of awareness. I wanted to allow that engagement and participation to be optional and not forceful. I also wanted to use the exhibit as a platform to invite the public in for a larger conversation about the intersectionality of intimate partner violence, how an individual's race, gender, class, disability, and other circumstances complicate but also direct how they seek, engage in, and receive care. Intimate partner violence is complex. It is not just a simple stereotype of a woman being battered and refusing to leave her partner. It is about a whole complex system of problems and obstacles that any person faces when contemplating leaving an abusive situation. It is also about structures and systems that keep a person in situations of violence. Throughout the gallery, there are discreetly placed QR codes that address these intersections and allow the public to choose to go deeper in understanding IPV. These QR codes also link to resources and additional help for anyone finding themselves in the gallery and in need. So a person can walk into the gallery and look at these abstract images and walk right out and have no idea what they just looked at or what it means. Similarly, a person can walk into a grocery store and have a brief interaction with someone who is experiencing intimate partner violence and have no idea that person's life is under threat and that every day they are trying to survive. In a world where gender-based violence is made invisible, this sort of encounter is unfortunately quite common. This is part of what I wanted to create in the gallery. An experience where the audience unwittingly mimics or reenacts the ways we are socially responding to intimate partner violence. There are 6 large works in the gallery, and I'm going to walk you through reviewing each of them. The main visual art in the exhibit is a series of archival protests of documented femicide and intimate partner femicide, specifically in America and Canada in 2021, the year the UN coined intimate partner violence a shadow pandemic. This image is the largest painting at 15 feet wide and 7 feet tall and has 1,689 marks, counting the number of documented American women killed by an intimate partner in 2021. These numbers come from data of less than 63% of police agencies, making the number a gross underestimate. These marks were made by house rags, representational of domestic place. I wanted to symbolically communicate that the home is the most dangerous and lethal place to be for someone experiencing abuse. I heard repeatedly during the opening of this exhibit, I had no idea it was this many. I had no idea it was this bad. There's a double punch in that reaction, with the reality being, oh, it is not that bad. It is actually way worse. Women who are targeted into abusive relationships are some of the strongest women we know, not the weakest, and it is a reflection of our world and how these women do not succeed in getting out of their abuse. In the image, I wanted to push against this victim stereotype and create a presence of strength, resilience, and fight in the marks of lives lost, as if they were even protesting their way off the canvas or onto it. This was a previously vibrant painting called The Collective that was in my office. For this exhibit, the image was painted over, leaving only bullet hole entry points to show the life and vibrancy underneath. Painting over the image was a symbolic practice of loss and sacrifice. There are 68 marks on this painting that count the number of documented Canadian femicides by an intimate partner in 2021. There are 2 large paintings, approximately 4 by 7 feet each, in the gallery that are not archival, but instead offer a place of pause and reflection and a place of visual rest. This image is called The Family and represents the collective family that interconnects us all, but also the internal family of the self that creates autonomy and safety and self-reliance. Under the image is a QR code that when scanned takes you to a site called How to Safety Plan to help a person experiencing violence make a plan for safety. This is an example of another QR code discreetly placed in the gallery. Under the other non-archival painting is a QR code that takes a person to a live memorial wall where the public can practice breaking their own silence in connection to this exhibit. This painting is called The Following and suggests a collective movement towards something, and in this case symbolizes a collective movement against gender-based violence. This minimalist painting, titled 174, marks the number of Canadian femicides documented in 2021. I'm going to use this painting to give you an example of how colonialism is woven into the architecture of this immersive exhibit. Today, Indigenous women and girls make up less than 5% of the Canadian population, but represent 24% of all counted homicide victims, making them 12 times more likely to be murdered. In the U.S., 84% of Indigenous women experience violence in their lifetime, and cases of missing and murdered Indigenous persons often go underreported and untracked. Kate Shanley, a former professor of Native American Studies, wrote, "Native peoples are a permanent present absence in the U.S. colonial imagination, an absence that reinforces at every turn the conviction that Native peoples are indeed vanishing and that the conquest of Native lands is justified." The night of the opening, I observed 2 white women having a reaction as they walked through the gallery. While people's reactions were quite mixed, these women stood out because they were laughing, jeering, pointing, and saying in a mocking tone, "Violence! This is so dumb!" They were saying this specifically in front of the painting 174, as they doubled over in laughter and read about the femicide in Canada and the erasure of Indigenous women. In Angela Pelster-Weeb's article, White Artists Need to Start Addressing White Supremacy in Their Work, she wrote, "White artists often fail at this work because they haven't centered themselves within the violence of their own whiteness. Had any of them placed themselves in the position of the aggressor instead of the victim, and then asked themselves what it means to inherit the violent history of being born white, I imagine some different kinds of art might have been made." Those women criticizing my art in that moment were centering me in the violence of my own whiteness. And in that moment, I felt an appreciation for the visibility of where the work is and what still needs to be done. To create this level of controversy and behavior in a small, intimate gallery confirmed in me I had done something right in bringing out of the shadows some of the very issues and barriers that need to be addressed when talking about intimate partner violence. To have the privilege to not even have to take in or understand concepts of being undocumented and murdered is at the brokenness of our existence as a colonized people. And it is built on hierarchy and defense. It is part of the silencing and erasure of lives lost and helps us identify settler or white fragility. Centering marginalized experience in an exhibit about femicide is critical in priming the public for a more accurate conversation about what is necessary for change. From a psychological perspective, most humans do not want to identify with the harm of others. There are the stages of grief that have been normalized: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance that I saw play out in the gallery space the night of the opening. On the subject of grievability and privilege, Judith Butler has contributed largely. She writes in Frames of War, One way of posing the question of who we are in these times of war is by asking whose lives are considered valuable, whose lives are mourned, and whose lives are considered ungrievable. We might think of war as dividing populations into those who are grievable and those who are not. An ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived. That is, it has never counted as a life at all. We can see the division of the globe into grievable and ungrievable lives from the perspective of those who wage war in order to defend the lives of certain communities and to defend them against the lives of others, even if it means taking those latter lives, end quote. In terms of the documented lives lost that are not accounted for on these walls, these are the ungrievable lives Butler is referencing that I wanted to bring forward in the absence of the markings. Colonialism and imperialism are major drivers of gender-based violence. Colonized countries are 50 times more prevalent to have higher rates of domestic violence than non-colonized countries. This final image is titled "Put a Pin in It." This is an 8 by 8 foot installation of 4,970 flowers hand-pinned to the wall to count the documented number of women of American femicides in 2021. The Gomphrena flower was chosen for its Greek interpretation of immortality, their inexhaustible vitality in harsh conditions, and their history of being brought to America by settlers during the colonial period. Pinning these flowers took nearly 100 hours of labor, and in this act, I wanted to communicate through the image the importance of labor as an essential agent to push against systemic harm. Here's a closer view of it up on the wall inside the clear cases. The phrase "put a pin in it" is traditionally used to temporarily postpone a discussion or task with the intention of returning to it later. The phrase likely originated in World War II when a soldier would put a pin back in a grenade for future use. Using this phrase, I wanted to draw attention to the tragedy women face in the stalling and silencing that occurs when they do try to speak up, and how negligence and silencing can result in death. Blaming, shaming, dismissal, disbelief, excusing violence, encouraging a woman to stay and work it out are all forms of silencing that exist in the culture of gender-based violence and continue as barriers and obstacles to receiving the help and care needed to survive abusive situations. In addition to the traditional paintings and flower installation, there are 3 flat screens with video installation in the gallery. This is a photograph of myself with the performers the day we filmed. One of the things that happens with violence, physical, emotional, psychological, is that a person can learn to leave their body, to not trust it, to disengage from it, out of a protective survival response. As a clinician who specializes in somatic work with the trauma body, I wanted to clearly put the physical body back into the gallery. Body politics in feminism refers to the study of how bodies are shaped, controlled, and experienced within a society, and how these experiences are linked to political and social power dynamics. It examines how bodies are included or excluded from social and political spheres, and how they are controlled and regulated through various systems like law, medicine, and culture. Feminist body politics also challenges the idea of the body as a passive object, arguing that bodies are actively involved in shaping and resisting power structures. Putting the body back into the room has become a signature part of my work in a sea of abstract art, as if the bodies are calling out in protest, perhaps even in protest of their existence, but also creating a disturbance and a disorientation for the viewer. I witnessed this in the gallery the night of the opening, people asking, what do these images of these women have to do with the paintings? I wanted there to be an element of uncomfortability and controversy in the room to get the attention of those who are not paying attention and awake those of us who have been what I call cultured into silence. This video was the original mock-up of what eventually became the filmed installation. The movement was conceptualized after years of watching someone who I love dearly finally get the courage to seek help only to be repeatedly failed by those systems. Many court systems that acknowledge intimate partner violence require those who have been physically abused by their partner to handwrite the protection order request on small sheets of paper in a public setting, regardless of their physical or emotional distress. In this image, I am attempting to write out the words, I'm trying to tell you something. The risk of death is greatest when a woman is leaving her partner. For many, filing a protection order is a waiting period of life or death. In this mock-up, I have my husband holding the bands so that I can trial their strength and feasibility. He was asked to apply restraint in arbitrary fashion while I focused my own strength and ability to write on the paper beneath me. The bands are routinely used to wrap my large paintings for shipping to protect them from harm, but here they act as barriers to communication and finding a path out, not unlike the systems we have designed to help. Here we have 2 systems trying to assist in a way out, both working against each other without direct intention to do so. At one point, as you just saw, the only way I can reach the paint to write, I'm trying to tell you something, is by dipping my hair in it. Even though my loved one had her life threatened on numerous occasions, being thrown down the stairs a month after giving birth, being beaten in hotel rooms on more than one occasion and left alone with no ability to call out, being stranded on a road while pregnant, being strangled and injured. The judge only ordered a few hours of anger management therapy for her abuser, and within a couple weeks, her protection order for herself and her child who had reported abuse was canceled, and she was right back in the same situation she had been in for years. The film installation, I'm Trying to Tell You Something, is about the systemic humiliation, absurdity, dismissal, discriminatory responses, the blaming, the frustration of being silenced, yet tied to those systems for survival and care. The performance is constructed to raise questions about sexual violence, harming while helping, the politics of the female body, and the act of not leaving the body but inviting it back in with all of its instincts as a form of reclaiming power. Violence is maintained in systems of power that dominate beliefs, perspectives, and expectations about women and their bodies in ways that control them and the services they receive. Actively working to dismantle the architecture of violence at every intersection is essential to changing gender-based violence in everyday life. A lot of consideration went into creating these images in terms of taking care of the performers, being sure they understood what they were getting into, and giving them the option to tap out at any time. In creating these protections around them, I felt comfortable asking the performers to give me their authenticity. Their role was simple: to allow themselves to be tied up in these systems or bands and to authentically move their way out of them into more freedom and choice. Claire Bishop wrote in Artificial Hells, quote, "By setting up a situation that unfolds with a greater or lesser degree of unpredictability, artists give rise to a highly directed form of authenticity. Singular authorship is put into question by delegating control of the work to the performers. They confer upon the project a guarantee of realism," end quote. So there is a visual representation of bodies tied to systems. All bodies move differently through those systems. The experience of those systems is different for everyone, yet all are bound and silenced in some way. During the filming, I was able to observe a key moment for each performer where something clicked and it suddenly felt personal, emotional, and what I would call, in my own words, intolerable. We all felt it in our own ways. I also wanted to create a visual commentary on sexual violence through the way this was staged, but not through the body as unclothed or overtly sexualized. The body does move in ways of resistance and power, and the body is a sexual entity, and it was important not to cancel that out or steer it away. Coming back to this understanding of trauma being in the body, I wanted to create a situation that allowed the body to move through and move out of being immobile, frozen, and incapacitated. Movement is essential in change making. I do believe what came out is representation of power and agency. That ownership of agency is what we all hope to encourage in survivors moving through their own unique process and out of violence. What was also central in these images was putting the survivor in the center of her own healing journey, allowing her to move how she needed to move in order to get free. One final layer of this opening night was to include a live performance. This performance was something I contractually agreed to prior to the work being fully realized or created. And as I neared the opening night, I found every idea I imagined for a performance to be highly problematic and anxiety-provoking. For one, I had come to understand fully that I would have to perform alone. Performance for me is inherently experimental, ideally crowd-tested, and as such carries problems with interpretation and meaning, as well as risks of psychological or physical harm to the performer. This performance was a main method of attempting to address what I've referred to as patriarchal terrorism. I did not feel comfortable delegating this performance to anyone else and felt it important to place the risk solely on myself. One of the greatest problems with the performance for me is that in the United States, white women have been the media face of domestic violence, and while our presence is important, our fronted presence has contributed to the erasure of marginalized women. Making myself a visible object in the gallery felt like a contradiction. Directly quoting from a report on From Margins to Center listening sessions, an initiative of the Racial and Economic Equity for Survivors Project, white women need to show up, do the work, look at their own privilege and how that impacts their work and how they look at others. So much of the domestic violence approach is run by white women, and unless they are doing the work, they have no idea what we need, how we're experiencing this, and the barriers we face to getting the help we need. We run into some brick walls where a lot of our programs just want to focus on a lot of perpetrator violence, not really giving a lot of thought to racism or racial violence, and all those ways can be their own kind of oppression. We get back to treat all people equally, and that's where we run into a wall. You notice how people of color have to do improvised advocacy for themselves. I see them navigating life, not having access to resources. I notice who comes in for services and who doesn't, because the word gets out that we have Spanish-speaking staff, and it also spreads the other way. They don't speak Korean, don't go there. End quote. As an act of decentering myself and surrounding this body of work responsibly, I organized others. I called, wrote, followed up with at least 70 different individuals and organizations in our community. Organizations representing immigrants and refugees, our BIPOC community, the LGBTQ2+ community, and organizations representing Indigenous women. The gallery provided free public space and access to an information session about IPV, a diverse expert panel discussion centered toward hope and culturally sensitive dialogue, and a survivor art showcase, also open to community participation. As the live performer, I then took on the act of load-bearing a message about psychological abuse that I did not want projected onto others. On the wall in the back of the gallery is a projection of text and landscapes that on the opening night of this exhibit were first shown projected onto my body while I stood on the pedestal in a Wonder Woman pose, towering over the gallery walkers. I had a light pink cat suit on, and some gallery walkers thought I was a mannequin. I stood motionless for an hour while some groups gathered to watch for 15 minutes or more, and others peered in from the street or observed interspersed while reading the art. Some walked in front of the projector, blocking out the image at times, unaware of my presence, while others were transfixed by it. This again for me reflected back the variation in our current level of awareness in society about gender-based violence. Opening night in Pioneer Square is lively and usually a large turnout. I would learn later the gallery had its largest attendance in the last 2 years on this night. From the periphery of my towering stance, I got to take in the reactions from above. I watched many women protest their partners not to go inside, while others came bolting into gallery, wanting to know what was going on. The quotes projected onto my body were insulting texts about women, many of them uneducated responses to a loved one, and statements from world leaders and abusers. This was a direct way of referencing how society participates in violence against women through quotes that depict shame, blame, and silencing. I wanted to dispel the myth that intimate partner violence and violence against women is only physical and start to unpack how violence against women is depicted, condoned, modeled, and supported by some of the most powerful people in the world. The week before this exhibit opened, Girl on Girl by Sophie Gilbert was published and circulating on national media. While I've not read it, the timing struck me. A New York Times review said, quote, "Throughout the book, she pushes against the narrative that pop culture is merely a distraction from hard news, arguing instead that it is inextricable from some of the most traumatic events of this century." End quote. This mentality sums up my performance perfectly. At the end of the performance, I took off my mask and screamed at the top of my lungs and walked out of the room. The treatment of women's bodies and the treatment of land share parallels in how patriarchal norms often lead to exploitation and control, with men disproportionately benefiting from both. The projections of land and clear cutting on my body are images generously provided by the photographer T.J. Watt. There's a strong positive correlation between climate change and gender-based violence. As an imperialist society, I'm signaling to Americans this is another way we participate directly in harm through policy, negligence, or sheer ignorance in not understanding we are all connected. I've given you a more whole understanding of the use of these images in the space. I can share with you that the combination of performance, video, bodies in the room, abstract art was also a social experiment that proved what I anticipated. The public would show up and reenact the different views and sides the public takes on gender-based violence and treatment of women. Some viewed passively, some cried, some became angry and cursed in rants, some mocked, and some remained quiet and withdrawn and contemplative. As a social worker and social activist, desiring transformative change, this was a sobering moment of what I perceive as the truth of where we are and the work that remains. Rita Segato said, "It will be necessary to shake the fantasy of the state, the fantasy of law, the safe harbor and terra firma, sustaining the patriarchal and state certainties that impede our advancement. It will be necessary, for example, to re-examine the unachievable inclusive formula of human rights, different but equal, which papers over the persistent, unassailable binary asymmetry in which a masculine subject who pretends to be universal prevails." End quote. What we know is our mainstream service and safety systems are too often inaccessible, inhospitable, or outright discriminatory to survivors on the social margins. This can result in many things, but one of them is being re-traumatized and powered over in a system that is meant to help, in a way that mirrors back the abuse a person has experienced with an intimate partner. This mirroring back is a critical issue to look at. Going a little bit deeper before we close here, I want to relate back to how these flowers are encased. In this image, there is myself in live performance being reflected or mirrored back into the installation of flowers. The clear cases were intended to create a museum quality in the archival presentation of the documented femicides. This display was in direct response and reflection to Ariella Azoulay's controversial statement about museums. She says, "I'm interested in ways looted objects did not just happen into cultural institutions, but are constitutive of the various scholarly, curatorial, and professional procedures, of which collecting is but one example, which have transformed world violence into a decent and acceptable occupation." Azoulay is talking about art collecting as a scheme of violence, and that many of the arts housed in museums were seized during the colonial era and kept on display. While these flowers were not seized, the form of documentation and the appearance of these cases makes a mockery of our institutional approach and how we document the lives of women. Here I am drawing a parallel between the treatment of museum objects and the treatment of women's bodies as forms of possession and stories of captivity and erasure, stories which are entirely false in the numbers. Azoulay states, "This empire of violence is mediated as documents. We have to unlearn the document. We have to unlearn the habitation, the foundation of what we thought were the foundations of knowledge." End quote. These documents I've put up on the walls are meant to create an unlearning, an awareness of the magnitude and an awareness of the erasure. And coming back to the mirroring back of abuse, the cases also house a reflection of the self looking in on the flowers. The self gets to see its own reflection and to consider one's own participation in silence and erasure. This disorientation in the room, discomfort, some places of rest, and some purely activist space help to recreate not only the challenge of unsilencing one's own story, but also the disorientation of how we do that as a community. As I spoke with many organizations who are doing incredible work and working so hard to serve people experiencing domestic abuse, a major topic of discussion was burnout, systemic challenges, and barriers to doing the work. This body of work calls us forward to reconsider our own awareness and action, to mobilize help and push against barriers that maintain systems of harm. It is in the collective we that change occurs. In a time when some of our most treasured academic systems in America are under threat, I think about education and awareness as the antidote for silence and one of the greatest ways of addressing gender-based violence. I want to thank Prayaas again for this invitation to speak today and for the time Sangram, Debyasri, and Paramita have taken to collaborate with me on this webinar, and for the opening this has created for future collaboration. I also want to thank Ray Freeman, the president of CoCA, and Dave Francis, the curator of the gallery, for their tremendous support in the creation and duration of this exhibit. Thank you.